In the heart of ancient China, beneath the glowing lanterns of jade palaces and the polished silence of imperial courts, a far darker truth was hidden, one that emperors themselves sought to bury beneath centuries of glory. For behind the delicate poetry of civilization, behind the order and grace of the Middle Kingdom, existed rituals so unspeakable that even the gods seemed to turn their eyes away. Execution in China was not simply punishment. It was a philosophy, a divine act that bound heaven and earth through human flesh. The emperor's justice was absolute, his command divine, and to die beneath his decree was to be judged not only by men, but by heaven itself. Imagine the forbidden city at dawn, mist curling through the vermilion gates, drums echoing across marble courtyards. Soldiers in silk and iron await the emperor's word, while trembling prisoners kneel in silence. No one speaks. For when the Son of Heaven commands death, it is not murder. It is balance, restoring the sacred harmony between order and chaos, virtue and corruption, heaven and man. Yet what that balance required could defy every boundary of compassion. To outsiders, China's ancient justice system appeared refined, steeped in ritual, moral reasoning, and celestial symbolism. But those who witnessed its darker face knew a different truth. Here, beauty and horror intertwined like twin serpents. An execution was not a simple end. It was a performance, carefully choreographed to embody the will of the cosmos. The condemned man's final breath was a sacrifice to the principle of order, a reminder that even a single life, crushed under imperial authority, could serve a moral purpose. The act of dying became sacred theater, watched not only by men but believed to be observed by spirits, ancestors, and the heavens themselves. Yet beneath this ideology of harmony lurked the machinery of fear. Entire families could vanish under accusations of treason, entire villages silenced to preserve peace. The same empire that revered poetry and calligraphy also engineered punishments so methodical they resembled art. The same brush that painted verses of love could sign decrees of unimaginable cruelty. And that duality, civilization wrapped around savagery, is what defined the soul of ancient China. The chronicles speak in whispers of punishments that no dynasty dared claim as its own. Acts so horrific that their very mention was banned in official records. But those who saw them never forgot. There were executions that lasted for hours, deaths meant to unmake a man's body piece by piece, until his spirit was believed to scatter like dust. There were silken suicides granted to nobles, poison cups given to scholars, and deaths so theatrical they blurred the line between ceremony and nightmare. For in this world, mercy was not a virtue, it was weakness. The empire's survival depended on obedience, and obedience demanded fear. The rites of execution were the ultimate lesson, that the emperor's word was not to be questioned, his will not to be resisted. It was a display of divine authority made flesh, where one man's death became a nation's warning. As centuries passed, these rituals grew more elaborate, more refined, until they no longer resembled justice at all but spiritual choreography, a way to remind both victim and spectator that heaven's balance must be maintained, no matter the cost. And so, the forgotten execution rites of ancient China were born, ceremonies that fused punishment with faith, morality with terror. They were designed not just to kill, but to cleanse, to make death itself an instrument of cosmic order. But time has a way of burying the things it cannot justify. Dynasties fell, temples crumbled, and the emperors who once held heaven's mandate turned to dust. What remained of their cruel theater was scattered across forbidden texts and banned manuscripts, their secrets whispered only among executioners, priests, and ghosts. And yet, in the quiet chambers of history, their echoes remain. Beneath every silk robe and painted wall lies the memory of those who died for order, victims of a divine system that made suffering sacred. These were the rites that were meant to be forgotten, banned forever, erased from memory. But to understand them is to glimpse the soul of a civilization, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly human. In ancient China, death was never random. It was measured, deliberate, and above all, sanctioned by heaven. Every execution, no matter how brutal or merciful, was seen as an extension of cosmic justice, flowing through the emperor himself. He was the Son of Heaven, the living bridge between the divine and mortal worlds. His duty was not simply to rule, but to maintain Tianming, the mandate of heaven, a sacred balance that held the universe together. When he ordered a man's death, it was not vengeance. It was purification. It was the removal of rot from the moral body of the empire. The philosophy that shaped this terrifying order was born from three great forces: Confucian virtue, legalist discipline, and Taoist fatalism. Together, they formed a trinity of control. Confucianism gave it moral language. Every person had a place in the grand hierarchy, and to defy it was to defy heaven. Legalism gave it teeth. Absolute obedience was the foundation of peace, and cruelty was a tool to preserve it. Taoism gave it inevitability. Life and death were not opposites but flowing currents, and execution was simply the river correcting its course. To the imperial mind, justice was sacred geometry. The emperor's throne mirrored the pole star, unmovable, divine, the axis around which all life revolved. Beneath him, ministers, soldiers, peasants, and slaves formed the concentric circles of order. When one circle cracked, chaos bled through, and the emperor had to act. Death was his instrument, the way he restored symmetry to a broken world. It was not a matter of passion but precision. The condemned man was a thread torn from heaven's tapestry, his execution the mending stitch. Inside the imperial courts, this philosophy came to life like theater. Imagine the hall of supreme harmony, golden dragons carved into every pillar, incense thick in the air, the faint tremor of drums in the distance. The accused is brought forth, shackled but silent, his fate already written. The ministers kneel in perfect rows, awaiting the emperor's decree. A gesture of his hand determines whether a man lives or dies. No anger, no hesitation. Only duty. And when the command is given, the scribe records it in crimson ink, the color of divine order. Every death was recorded, categorized, and justified through moral logic. Crimes were not simply offenses against the law, they were wounds against harmony. Murder disrupted human balance. Treason disrupted political balance. Blasphemy disrupted cosmic balance. The punishment, therefore, was not only about retribution, it was about realignment. The empire did not believe in forgiveness, it believed in correction. When a man was executed, his death was not meant to end him, but to cleanse the moral world he had stained. Confucian scholars defended this logic with serene conviction. To kill one man, they wrote, is to save 10,000. In their eyes, cruelty was compassion on a grand scale. The executioner's blade, dripping with blood, was not the hand of evil. It was the extension of virtue, wielded to preserve harmony. The emperor, therefore, did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as merciful, sparing countless others from the chaos that one corrupt life might unleash. But the morality of power always hides a darker hunger. Behind the sacred justifications lay something far more human: fear. The emperor's power existed only as long as the people believed it was divine. And belief required performance. Public executions became rituals of reaffirmation, spectacles where divine justice was proven through suffering. Crowds gathered not merely to watch men die, but to witness heaven's law in action. The victims' screams were not seen as cruelty, but as proof that the gods approved the emperor's command. Still, not all who stood beneath the dragon throne believed in the illusion. Some ministers, old and weary, wrote their doubts in secret journals. If heaven demands blood, one lamented, then perhaps we have built our heaven in man's image, not God's. Others began to see the contradictions, how emperors justified their tyranny as moral necessity, and how righteousness became the mask of fear. Yet even in their doubt, they obeyed. To question the emperor's judgment was to invite the same fate as those condemned by it. As dynasties rose and fell, the mandate of heaven remained unchallenged, a divine story that explained both power and punishment. Emperors claimed that heaven withdrew its favor from unjust rulers, sending floods, famines, and rebellions as warnings. But they never questioned their right to spill blood in heaven's name. Every execution, every dismemberment, every silken suicide was framed as an act of restoration. No matter how grotesque the act, it could be sanctified by ritual. This was the terrible beauty of the system. Its cruelty was made sacred, its violence moral. Death became ceremony, and ceremony became faith. The condemned were not simply punished, they were transformed into instruments of cosmic order. Their deaths became offerings to a God that demanded symmetry, not compassion. And in this divine theater, the emperor stood as both priest and judge, his word the only scripture that mattered. In time, this belief would give rise to the most elaborate execution rituals the world had ever seen, punishments designed not only to end life, but to display heaven's wrath upon flesh. For if justice was divine, then suffering was proof of its perfection. The emperor did not merely rule men. He ruled the boundary between life and death itself, and to cross that boundary without his sanction was to unmake the universe. Thus, the forgotten rites of ancient China were born from faith as much as fear, from the belief that pain could purify, that obedience could sanctify cruelty, and that even the most horrific deaths could serve a higher harmony. And so long as the Son of Heaven sat upon his throne, death remained divine, an unbroken circle of power, blood, and silence. In the grand machinery of ancient Chinese law, justice was not an idea. It was a living organism made of blood, bone, and ritual. The empire believed that to maintain cosmic harmony, society had to be governed by visible symbols of punishment, each representing a tier of moral decay. Thus were born the 5 punishments, Wu Xing, a system so precise, so deeply interwoven with philosophy and fear, that it transformed human suffering into an instrument of divine order. These punishments were not only judicial tools, they were a language of power written upon the body of the condemned. Every cut, every scar, every mutilation carried meaning. It was a system that promised balance through brutality, law written in flesh. The 5 punishments evolved across dynasties, but their essence remained constant: tattooing, amputation, castration, execution, and death by dismemberment. Each level corresponded to the gravity of the crime and the status of the offender. The Confucian mind believed that punishment should not only correct behavior but also serve as moral instruction for society. The sight of a marked, broken, or silenced body was not simply deterrence, it was education. In a world where literacy was rare, pain became the empire's most eloquent teacher. The first punishment, tattooing, mo, was both physical and spiritual damnation. Those branded bore the emperor's judgment on their skin for life. Words or symbols were carved into the forehead or cheeks using iron needles dipped in black ink, declaring their crime to all who looked upon them. A thief might bear the character for steal. A deserter might carry coward. The punishment was designed not only to scar the flesh but to exile the soul. A man's face was his identity, to defile it was to remove him from humanity. Even death could not cleanse such shame, for ancestors with marked skin could not return to the spiritual lineage. In the Confucian world, where family honor was eternal, this was a fate worse than execution. The second stage was amputation, the removal of essential body parts, such as the nose, feet, or hands. The act served dual purposes: to punish and to humiliate. Those who lost their feet were rendered useless for labor or military service. Those without a nose carried the visible sign of disgrace for life. In some cases, even the ears were cut off, transforming the criminal into a living warning. There was no hiding such punishment. It was an open wound that never healed, a reminder that the emperor's justice reached into the bones. To the rulers, mutilation was a form of balance. The man who disrupted order would lose a part of himself so that order might be restored. The empire saw the body as a mirror of the moral self. To harm it was to correct it. The third punishment was perhaps the most psychologically devastating: castration, gong xing. It was often reserved for crimes involving treachery, moral corruption, or sexual misconduct. Castration stripped a man not only of his lineage but his identity. To be made a eunuch was to be both alive and dead, a creature of utility, denied the future, chained forever to service within the palace. Many eunuchs were forced to serve the same emperors who condemned them, their mutilated existence turned into lifelong obedience. In the eyes of the state, they were purified, stripped of desire, remade into tools of empire. But beneath that surface lay unspeakable torment. Many chose suicide over survival. Those who lived carried the ultimate symbol of submission, their bodies transformed into instruments of control, their silence bought by fear. The fourth punishment was execution, death rendered not in chaos but in ceremony. It could take many forms: beheading, hanging, or strangulation. But even death was stratified by class and morality. A noble might be granted this silken death, strangled with an embroidered cord in the privacy of his quarters, his dignity preserved. A commoner might be beheaded in the public square, his head displayed as warning. The method of death was not arbitrary. It reflected the balance between sin and virtue, rank and dishonor. Execution was a solemn affair. Witnesses described the faint sound of bells, the reading of imperial decrees, and the unwavering stillness of the condemned. There was no begging, no mercy. The empire believed that in dying obediently, even a criminal could restore harmony to the moral order. And then came the final and most feared of all, death by dismemberment, or Lingchi. The ultimate punishment reserved for those who defied the emperor or heaven itself. The condemned was tied to chariots or posts, their limbs severed one by one, their body torn apart until nothing recognizable remained. To destroy the body so completely was to deny the soul its return to the ancestors. In a culture where family continuity was sacred, this was the purest form of annihilation: physical, spiritual, eternal. Even the ashes of such men were sometimes forbidden burial, their names erased from family records. This was the death that silenced bloodlines and erased history. Each punishment was meant to preserve order through terror. It was not random cruelty, it was deliberate spectacle. The empire depended on obedience, and obedience depended on fear. Every punishment had an audience. The branding of a thief, the hobbling of a traitor, the death of a scholar, all were witnessed by those meant to learn from them. The execution grounds were theaters of morality, where heaven's law was demonstrated in human agony. The spectators did not weep, they reflected. For in that pain, they saw the emperor's authority affirmed and their place in the cosmic order reinforced. But behind the precision of law, there was something darker: the quiet realization that cruelty had become civilization. Philosophers wrote of virtue and order, yet the instruments of torture hung gleaming in every province. Bamboo rods, inked needles, iron blades, all part of the same elegant mechanism that built palaces and temples. The bureaucracy that calculated tax ledgers also calculated the number of lashes a man could survive. Harmony and horror were two sides of the same coin. By the Han dynasty, the 5 punishments were codified in the Book of Law, each accompanied by ceremonial procedures, official phrases, and state rituals. Punishment was a sacred duty, carried out with precision and reverence. Even the executioner, the lowest of the low, performed his role as part of heaven's choreography. To hesitate was sin, to pity was rebellion. Centuries later, reformers and poets would look back on the system with a mixture of horror and fascination. How could a civilization so devoted to art, philosophy, and compassion construct such machinery of pain? But that is the paradox of empire: the more refined its ideals, the more exquisite its cruelty. The 5 punishments were not the work of savages, they were the creation of scholars, philosophers, and priests. Men who believed that in suffering, the world could be purified. In this sacred order of blood, each punishment spoke a single message: that no one, not even the highest minister or the most humble peasant, could exist outside the emperor's will. Through these rites, death became instruction, mutilation became morality, and fear became the cornerstone of peace. Thus, the empire endured, not through mercy, but through ritualized suffering that claimed to serve heaven, even as it devoured men whole. In the chronicles of human cruelty, few deaths are as infamous or as haunting as Lingchi, known to the Western world as death by 1,000 cuts. It was not simply execution, it was a ceremony of annihilation. To die by Lingchi was to be erased slowly, publicly, and spiritually. It was the ultimate punishment, reserved for crimes so monstrous that even a swift death was considered mercy unearned. And yet, what made it terrifying was not the blood, but the calm, the ritual precision that turned human suffering into art. Imagine the imperial courtyard at dawn, a pale mist rolling through the air, the scent of sandalwood masking something far heavier beneath it. The condemned is bound to a wooden frame, his arms stretched wide like a broken offering to heaven. Around him, officials read the emperor's decree in steady tones, their words echoing through the silence like a funeral chant. The crowd gathers, merchants, peasants, soldiers, and monks, all summoned not merely to watch, but to witness. For Lingchi was never a private act. It was a moral performance, a message to the empire that treason, sacrilege, or betrayal of kin would not only be punished, it would be undone. The executioner, often a man trained for decades, approaches with reverence. His blade is thin, sharp as breath, and every movement is deliberate. Lingchi was not a frenzy of violence, it was a measured progression of pain. Each cut had meaning, beginning with the removal of flesh from the chest, arms, and thighs, then slowly moving toward the face, the abdomen, and finally the limbs. Records from the Ming and Qing dynasties describe anywhere from 30 to over 100 cuts, sometimes stretching over hours. The goal was not simply to kill, but to disassemble. Death came only at the end, often by decapitation, but the true punishment was in the endurance, the stripping away of self, dignity, and identity, one cut at a time. In the eyes of the empire, Lingchi was not sadism. It was theology. The condemned was believed to have torn the moral fabric of the cosmos, and only by tearing his body apart could balance be restored. The pain, they said, cleansed the world. Every drop of blood shed was a drop of disorder removed from the empire's veins. The execution ground thus became a place of purification, a perverse form of spiritual hygiene performed before the eyes of heaven. There was ceremony even in the preparation. The condemned was given wine or opium to dull his senses, not out of mercy, but to prolong his consciousness. The executioner, wearing plain robes, would sometimes bow to the victim before the first cut, acknowledging that he was but a servant of justice. The first incision was often symbolic, a shallow wound across the chest to mark the beginning of the ritual. Each following cut deepened both the pain and the meaning. Flesh was peeled away in layers, sometimes shaped into floral patterns or scroll-like strips, creating a grotesque imitation of calligraphy written in blood. The audience was forbidden to cry out. Even the faintest whisper could be punished. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the blade against flesh, the slow rhythm of human suffering. It was said that those who watched could feel heaven's presence descending, that the moment of final agony cleansed not just the criminal but all who bore witness. Yet beneath the official theology lay something far darker: fascination. The human mind, trapped between horror and awe, could not look away. People spoke of the condemned who smiled through the ordeal, who maintained composure until the final breath, as if transcending mortal pain. Such men were rumored to be blessed by the gods, their deaths transforming into legend. One famous account tells of a Ming official named Yuan Chonghuan, accused of treason. Though loyal in truth, he was condemned by political enemies to die by Lingchi. Thousands gathered to watch as the execution began. Witnesses wrote that he did not scream, that he stared calmly toward the sky as the executioner's knife moved. When his heart was finally cut free, it was said that the crowd fell to their knees, not out of pity, but out of fear. They saw not a criminal, but a man purified through suffering. The paradox of Lingchi was its refinement. The empire prided itself on order, and even its cruelty was bound by etiquette. The execution ground was swept clean before the ritual began. Officials wore formal robes. The condemned's crimes were recited in literary verse. What should have been chaos was transformed into performance, the empire's own theater of divine law. The act of killing became sacred choreography, each cut a step in a dance between justice and sin. But beneath that calm, the true purpose was control. Lingchi was designed to terrify, to freeze rebellion in the womb of imagination. The thought of such death, slow, deliberate, unending, was enough to silence dissent for generations. Parents whispered it to their children as warning, rebels dreamt of it as the price of defiance. And so, through pain, the empire ruled not only bodies but minds. By the late Qing dynasty, foreign diplomats and Christian missionaries who witnessed Lingchi were horrified. They described the ritual as inhuman, barbaric, a mark of savagery beneath a civilized mask. But to the imperial court, these outsiders simply failed to understand. They saw only the blade, not the balance. To them, Lingchi was not brutality, it was symmetry. Just as harmony in art required precision, harmony in empire required suffering proportionate to sin. And yet, even within China, dissent grew. Philosophers, poets, and reformers began to question whether heaven truly required so much blood to maintain order. Some wrote that by cutting the body of a man, the empire was cutting the body of its own morality. Others whispered that the act had become a curse, that every dynasty which practiced Lingchi eventually fell into decay, haunted by its ghosts. Indeed, when the practice was finally abolished in 1905, it was said that the last executioner wept as he buried his blades, knowing that an era of divine cruelty had ended. But history does not forget easily. Lingchi remains more than a relic of the past, it is a mirror, a reflection of how easily belief can sanctify horror and how order can disguise itself in ritualized violence. It asks an unanswerable question. Did those who designed such deaths truly believe in cosmic justice? Or did they simply find in heaven a convenient mask for human fear? For centuries, the name Lingchi was forbidden, its records burned, its instruments destroyed. Yet the memory survived, whispered by scholars, painted in secret scrolls, and carried through the haunted silence of time. For even when erased, some acts are too profound, too monstrous, to die. And so, in the blood-soaked elegance of Lingchi, the empire revealed its truest self, majestic, disciplined, and utterly merciless. Among the labyrinth of punishments that shaped ancient China, one form of death stood apart, not for its savagery, but for its elegance. It was called the silken death, known to the court as Jin Si, the death of silk. Unlike the brutal spectacle of Lingchi, this was a quieter execution, shrouded in grace and reserved for the elite, nobles, scholars, and imperial concubines whose blood was considered too refined to be spilled in public. Yet beneath that softness of silk lay a truth no less cruel. This was beauty turned into execution, honor weaponized as death. The silken death was a privilege. It was granted not to the innocent, but to those whose guilt demanded discretion. A general who failed the emperor, a minister who conspired, an empress who fell from favor, all might be ordered to die by silk. To the empire, it was mercy, to the condemned, it was ritualized erasure. For in a world where the emperor's will was divine, even death had rank. A commoner would die by blade, a traitor by dismemberment, but the noble was expected to die beautifully. The setting of the silken execution was as deliberate as its symbolism. It did not unfold in the marketplace or before a crowd, but in the secluded chambers of the palace or a scholar's courtyard. The condemned was often granted a final meal, the finest wine, sometimes even music. Eunuchs or attendants would present a long, unknotted silk cord, pristine, smooth, the color of moonlight. The emperor's decree would be read aloud, its tone calm, almost tender. There was no screaming, no thrashing, no spectacle of blood. Only the slow tightening of silk around a throat, a whisper of fabric in the dark. Silk, in Chinese culture, was the fiber of purity, a divine material born from the patient labor of the silkworm, cherished by emperors and gods. It clothed the imperial body, wrapped the dead, and symbolized refinement. To die by silk was, therefore, to die wrapped in civilization itself. But the irony was profound. The same fabric that represented luxury and beauty became an instrument of suffocation. The empire had found a way to make death itself elegant. For women of the inner court, the silken death carried an especially cruel poetry. When a concubine was condemned, for infidelity, betrayal, or falling out of imperial favor, she was given the silk cord as a final act of compassion. In theory, it spared her public humiliation. In truth, it transformed her death into a ritual of obedience. To take the cord was to accept guilt, to die silently was to die with dignity. The chambermaids would dress her in white robes, comb her hair one last time, light incense. Then, kneeling before the emperor's decree, she would loop the cord around her neck and pull, or, if she could not, the attendants would finish it for her. Her death was quiet, graceful, and absolute. There are records of imperial women who faced this fate with chilling composure. Empress Zhao Fian, accused of witchcraft and treason, was ordered to die by silk. Witnesses wrote that she refused to weep, that she adjusted her robe before placing the cord upon herself. Others were not so calm. Some screamed, begged for mercy, or clung to the attendants. But even then, the empire demanded beauty, their cries muffled by silk, their terror hidden behind ritual. The silken death was also deeply gendered. Where men's executions celebrated domination and authority, women's deaths celebrated silence. A man was killed to make an example, a woman was killed to erase shame. Yet in both cases, death was theatrical. The silk cord replaced the sword, but the purpose was the same, to maintain the illusion of moral order. In a society where reputation was fate, even the method of dying was a reflection of one's worth. For scholars and high officials, strangulation by silk carried a different symbolism. It was the death of the intellect, the quiet end of those who once served as the empire's moral voice. Many scholars, condemned for political dissent or failed reforms, were given the silken honor. It allowed the emperor to dispose of them privately while appearing merciful. To the watching bureaucracy, it sent a clear message: even the wisest could be silenced gently. No need for spectacle when fear could be spread through refinement. In poetry and art, the silken death was immortalized as a paradox, a beautiful ending for a beautiful soul. Painters of later dynasties depicted pale women with silk cords lying beside them, their faces serene, their robes undisturbed. Poets compared the act to the falling of a white flower, silent and inevitable. But behind the elegance, the psychological violence lingered. To die in silence was to die unseen, denied even the small dignity of being remembered for one's suffering. The use of silk also reflected the empire's obsession with control. Silk was soft, obedient, and deadly, the perfect metaphor for how the court viewed its people, especially its women. Submission was the highest virtue, resistance the greatest sin. The silken cord was thus both execution and lesson. Beauty that disobeys must be strangled by beauty itself. In its quiet, it carried a cruelty even the blade could not match. Over time, the practice spread beyond the palace. Some noble families, when struck by scandal, chose to end their lives voluntarily with silk, seeing it as an honorable escape from public disgrace. Manuals of court etiquette even recorded the proper posture for such a death: the head slightly bowed, the robe neatly folded, the body resting upon silk mats. Death, like every other act in the empire, had to follow ritual. Yet, for all its supposed refinement, the silken death was no less terrifying. Those who witnessed it spoke of the eerie stillness that filled the room afterward, the lingering sway of the silk cord, the faint scent of incense, the unbearable quiet. Unlike Lingchi, which screamed its horror, the silken execution whispered it. It was cruelty disguised as serenity, violence cloaked in art. As the dynasties aged, the ritual became rarer, fading with the decline of the imperial court. When the last recorded silken execution took place in the late Qing era, it marked the end of a tradition that had balanced power and elegance with unbearable precision. But its symbolism outlived the empire. The silk cord became a metaphor for the beauty that kills, a reminder that behind every gesture of refinement, there can lurk a desire for control. Today, the silken death is remembered not only as an execution method but as a mirror of ancient China's soul. It reflected the empire's obsession with harmony. Even in killing, there must be balance. Even in cruelty, grace. The silk cord, soft yet fatal, embodied the paradox of civilization itself, that beneath the gentlest touch, there can lie the coldest hand of power. It was death as art, murder as ritual, silence as perfection. And in that silence, the empire whispered its truest creed, that beauty and obedience were worth dying for, and that the smoothest silk could be as deadly as the sharpest blade. There existed in ancient China a class of punishments so extreme, so morally corrosive, that even the empire itself eventually sought to erase them from its memory. These were not simply executions, they were acts of spiritual vengeance, reserved for those who had transgressed beyond human forgiveness: rebels, sorcerers, traitors, and those who defied heaven's order. They were called the cursed rites of the damned, punishments that defied mercy, rituals that promised suffering beyond the grave. To die under these rites was to vanish not only from life but from history. To understand these rituals, one must understand their purpose. In a civilization obsessed with cosmic harmony, certain crimes were seen as disruptions to the natural balance of existence. A murderer could be executed, a thief mutilated, but a blasphemer, a sorcerer, or a traitor had committed something far greater, an offense against heaven. These were not meant to be killed swiftly. They were to be made into examples, sacrifices to restore the sacred equilibrium they had violated. The empire believed such souls were polluted, contagious with chaos. And so, their punishment had to reach beyond death itself. The first and perhaps most feared of these cursed rites was Yao Zhan, or cutting at the waist. The victim was bound to a wooden platform, his arms stretched outward, his midsection marked with chalk. Before the assembled officials, an executioner's blade would fall clean through the torso, separating upper body from lower, a grotesque division that symbolized the cutting of the man's spirit from heaven. It was believed that one who died in halves could never find peace in the afterlife, for his soul was literally divided. In the Confucian world, where the wholeness of the body was sacred, this was annihilation. Even more terrifying was the method known as zhu lian, the punishment of extermination of 9 relations. It was not a single execution but the erasure of an entire family. When a man committed treason, not only he but his parents, siblings, children, even distant kin could be slaughtered to the 9th degree of relation. The logic was theological: evil, like disease, had to be purged from the bloodline. Entire estates were burned, family names stricken from records, ancestral tablets shattered. In a culture where remembrance was immortality, to destroy the family was to damn the soul forever. There were punishments meant to imitate the suffering of the netherworld itself. Boiling in oil, burning alive in bronze cauldrons, or being forced to swallow molten metal, these were reserved for sorcerers, heretics, and those accused of invoking dark spirits against the emperor. The rituals often included incantations from Taoist priests, who were summoned to contain the victim's restless ghost. The act was both execution and exorcism. To the onlookers, it was not merely punishment but purification, hell enacted upon earth to prevent chaos from spilling into heaven. Then came the cage executions, a grim spectacle of prolonged agony. The condemned were sealed within iron cages, hung at crossroads or outside city gates. Food and water were withheld, and death arrived not in hours, but in days. As the body decayed, the cage became a shrine of warning, the stench a sermon to obedience. Birds fed on the flesh while passers-by recited verses of loyalty to cleanse their thoughts. In time, the bones would be removed, crushed to powder, and scattered into rivers so that not even burial was possible. To be denied burial was the ultimate punishment in Chinese belief, for it meant eternal exile from the world of ancestors. One of the rarest and most symbolic rites was gokei, or flaying alive. The condemned was stripped of skin from the back and limbs, leaving muscles exposed like red silk. The flayed skin was sometimes hung upon the city gate or tanned into scrolls bearing the criminal's confession, displayed as moral scripture. Chroniclers wrote of emperors who ordered such punishments not in rage, but in solemn ritual, believing that the display of suffering purified the empire's moral decay. The cruelty of these rites was not born solely of malice. It was intertwined with superstition and the fear of cosmic contamination. Every dynasty lived under the shadow of rebellion and divine retribution. Earthquakes, plagues, eclipses, these were read as signs that heaven's mandate was faltering. To restore order, the emperor had to act decisively. The execution grounds became sacred altars, the executioners reluctant priests. When the condemned screamed, it was said that their voices appeased the thunder gods, their blood a libation poured into the soil of the empire. But the rituals also revealed something profoundly psychological about ancient Chinese civilization. They were performances of collective fear. The people watched not only out of obedience, but out of fascination. The idea that the universe could be cleansed through suffering was intoxicating. It gave meaning to pain. And in that belief, cruelty became an expression of order. As the dynasties evolved, the rites grew more elaborate, often blending religious ceremony with bureaucratic procedure. During the Tang and Song periods, special clerks recorded each stage of the execution, noting whether the condemned showed repentance. Monks and priests were sometimes invited to chant sutras, supposedly to guide the soul even as the body was destroyed. There was a haunting paradox at play: mercy offered through the very act of torture. By the late Imperial period, whispers spread among the literati that these rituals had become cursed themselves. It was said that the ghosts of the dismembered and flayed wandered the capital at night, their cries echoing through palace halls. Some emperors, driven mad by guilt or superstition, forbade the rites, only for their successors to revive them in times of unrest. It was a cycle of fear and faith, each generation both condemning and resurrecting its own horrors. When the Ming dynasty fell, many scholars looked back on these punishments as evidence of divine wrath, proof that cruelty had poisoned the heart of the empire. The Qing tried to reform the system, codifying punishments, sanitizing the process. Yet even then, the shadow of the cursed rites lingered. Secret executions continued in remote provinces, far from the capital's gaze. Officials still invoked old formulas, still burned incense before spilling blood. Civilization could change its laws, but it could not erase its ghosts. These forgotten punishments reveal a deeper truth about humanity, that the need to control evil often gives birth to greater evil. In trying to destroy corruption, the empire corrupted itself. The line between ritual and madness blurred until no one could tell whether they were serving heaven or merely feeding the machinery of fear. When, centuries later, reformers finally abolished the most horrific of these rites, the decrees spoke not of compassion, but of efficiency. The old methods were declared unfit for a modern empire. But beneath that bureaucratic language was shame, the realization that even the most enlightened civilization can become monstrous when it worships order more than mercy. And so, the cursed rites of ancient China were banned forever. The temples where they were performed fell silent, the scrolls describing them hidden or burned. Yet their echoes endure, in ghost stories, in forbidden texts, in the collective memory of a people who once believed that suffering could save the world. They are reminders that cruelty, once ritualized, becomes faith, and that even the gods may turn away from what man does in their name. By the time the later dynasties rose, the Ming and Qing, grand in ceremony yet trembling beneath their own weight, the empire began to see its reflection in the blood that stained its history. The execution grounds, once holy altars of justice, had become mirrors of something darker, man's appetite for order through suffering. The rulers who had once wielded divine power began to fear the gods themselves. And so began the slow unraveling, the age when China tried to bury its past, to ban the rituals that had defined its cruelty. Yet what is banned is not always forgotten. These were the punishments the empire tried to erase, the rites condemned as barbaric, the acts that history itself was forbidden to name. In the imperial archives, edicts survive written in trembling calligraphy, declaring certain punishments forever abolished. The emperors spoke of restoring human virtue, of protecting the dignity of civilization. But behind these decrees was not compassion, it was terror. They had come to believe the old methods were cursed. Every dynasty that practiced the extremes of execution had fallen, every emperor who ordered Lingchi had met a violent or shameful end. The superstition was simple yet powerful. Heaven tolerated order, but not excess. When cruelty became spectacle, the mandate of heaven withdrew. The Ming Emperor Hongwu, founder of his dynasty, was haunted by this belief. He had risen from poverty to power through rebellion and blood, and his rule was defined by paranoia. He ordered tens of thousands executed, scholars, ministers, generals, many by the very rites his successors would later forbid. Yet in his old age, records describe him waking at night screaming, claiming to see the faces of the flayed and dismembered outside his chamber. He ordered temples built to appease the souls of the unjustly executed, perhaps fearing they were his own judges. When he finally issued edicts limiting cruel punishments, he declared that heaven's balance must not be mocked. It was less an act of mercy than an attempt to silence ghosts. The Qing emperors inherited this moral fatigue. They saw themselves as guardians of a refined, enlightened order. In their chronicles, one reads of imperial scholars debating whether certain executions dishonored the state more than the criminal. Ministers wrote essays arguing that cruelty is the mark of weakness, that a strong empire should inspire awe, not terror. The punishment of Lingchi, used for centuries to destroy the worst offenders, was finally banned in 1905, an act as symbolic as it was practical. It marked the end of China's millennial-old belief that pain could purify society. Yet the ghost of cruelty did not vanish with the stroke of a pen. It lingered, in poems, in nightmares, in the memory of those who had seen what civilization looked like when it lost its reflection. The outlawed rites became whispers in tea houses and prisons, told by the old to the young as warnings. Never anger the emperor, they would say, for his mercy lasts only as long as his fear. The scholars of later centuries struggled with this paradox. How could a culture that revered harmony, compassion, and virtue have perfected the art of human suffering? Some argued that the empire's obsession with balance had turned inward, that in its pursuit of order it had learned to love its own cruelty. Others saw the bans not as repentance, but as reinvention, a new way to express control through subtler means. The instruments of pain were gone, but the philosophy of obedience remained. Even after the bans, the memory of these punishments haunted literature and art. Playwrights and poets smuggled their horror into allegory. A painting might show a lotus blooming from bloodied water, a metaphor for beauty rising from torment. A poem might describe a man whose soul was cut, not his body. In these hidden works, the empire's shame became its most enduring muse. The forbidden became myth, and myth became warning. Among the common people, belief in karmic justice persisted. The execution grounds were said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died unjustly. Travelers avoided certain crossroads where the cries of the executed were rumored to echo in the wind. Monks performed nightly chants to release the souls of the condemned, while local officials quietly built shrines to atone for the sins of their forebears. It was as if the entire nation was haunted not by what it had suffered, but by what it had done. Some of the last executioners left confessions in secret diaries. One described washing his hands for years in river water mixed with herbs, yet still feeling the warmth of blood that will not fade. Another wrote that each man he killed became a shadow in my dreams, and when I close my eyes, I hear them breathe. These accounts, written in trembling script, were later discovered by historians who recognized in them not guilt alone, but revelation, the first stirrings of conscience in a culture that had once sanctified cruelty. Still, the idea of erasure could never be complete. History is stubborn. The very effort to bury the past gave it new life in secrecy. Forbidden stories gain power because they are forbidden. The more the empire tried to forget, the more its ghosts demanded remembrance. The barbaric punishments became symbols of what happens when morality is used as armor for power, when men believe that suffering can be justified by law or faith. And yet, within this darkness, there was also an awakening. As reformers, scholars, and revolutionaries looked upon the ruins of the old order, they began to see a new vision of justice, one not born of fear but of humanity. The abolition of these rites became a kind of rebirth, a symbolic cleansing of the empire's conscience. But even as the guillotines and ropes of modern execution replaced the blades of the past, the psychological weight of what had been done remained. Civilization, it seemed, could not be untainted. The legacy of these banned rituals endured not through their practice, but through their absence. Their erasure became a silence that spoke louder than the screams they once produced. Each new law, each moral reform, carried the shadow of what it replaced. The imperial court no longer flayed or dismembered, but it still silenced dissent, still ruled through fear cloaked in virtue. The instruments of cruelty had changed, not the heart that wielded them. Centuries later, when historians unearthed the fragments of these forgotten punishments, the descriptions felt almost mythical, too deliberate, too symbolic to be real. But they were real. The inked decrees, the blood-stained ledgers, the broken bones found beneath temple ruins, all whispered the same truth, that the human capacity for control is endless, and that every empire, no matter how enlightened, hides its darkness behind the veil of order. The bans were not redemption, they were denial. The emperors could outlaw the blade, but not the belief that fear sustains power. The priests could burn the scrolls, but not the memory of the screams. What they called civilization was merely a quieter mask for the same hunger that had driven the first executioner to raise his knife. And so, the rites that were banned forever did not truly die. They became lessons, myths, ghosts in the mind of a nation that had looked too long into its own abyss. Their power now lies not in what they inflicted, but in what they revealed, that cruelty, once justified by order, never truly ends, it only changes its form. Throughout all of human history, no civilization has ever been free from cruelty. It may change its form, its tools, its rituals, but it never disappears. In the ashes of the old Chinese empires, after the execution rites were banned and the instruments of death destroyed, a new question began to haunt scholars and philosophers alike. Why do humans ritualize pain? Why do societies that dream of harmony always seem to build their peace upon suffering? The psychology of cruelty, like the punishments themselves, was an inheritance too powerful to be erased. To understand the mind that built the execution grounds of ancient China, one must look beyond politics and into the hidden chambers of belief. Cruelty there was never random. It was structured, sanctified, and even moralized. In every cut of the knife, every drop of blood spilled in ritual, there was a sense of purpose. Pain became communication, between ruler and subject, between human and heaven, between guilt and purification. For a civilization that viewed the cosmos as an intricate web of balance, suffering was a necessary correction, a grim form of healing. But there is a deeper truth that lingers beneath this logic. Humans are drawn to pain not because they enjoy it, but because it means something. Pain commands attention, it forces reflection, it creates order out of chaos. To watch another suffer is to witness boundaries restored, to believe, however falsely, that justice has been served. The ancient Chinese believed that each scream reaffirmed the moral fabric of the empire. They did not kill simply to punish, they killed to remind the world that the emperor's will was law, that the universe itself still obeyed him. The ritualization of cruelty gave it legitimacy. Pain ceased to be personal and became symbolic. Executioners became priests, victims became sacrifices, and the public became the congregation. The act of killing was stripped of chaos and dressed in meaning. This is the same mechanism that has repeated across every culture, from the Roman Colosseum to medieval inquisitions to modern warfare. Cruelty, when given structure, transforms into ceremony. And when given belief, it becomes divine. Psychologists centuries later would name this phenomenon the sacralization of violence, when power cloaks its brutality in the language of faith and morality. Ancient China perfected it. By binding cruelty to cosmology, the empire created a system where pain was not cruelty at all. It was duty. It offered redemption to the ruler, purpose to the executioner, and catharsis to the spectators. The condemned became both victim and vessel, a means through which the empire could cleanse itself of fear. This logic of sacred cruelty speaks to something timeless in human nature. People crave order more than they crave mercy. They would rather live under fear that feels predictable than in freedom that feels uncertain. The empire understood this. It turned violence into ritual precisely because ritual made it acceptable. It transformed horror into stability. Each execution, each punishment, reassured the people that someone was paying the price for chaos, that the world still made sense. Even the spectators, standing in silence as blood soaked the soil, were part of the ritual. They were not voyeurs but participants. Their horror, their awe, their forced calm, all served the state's psychological machinery. To look away was disobedience, to watch was submission. The people learned that empathy was dangerous, that pity could be mistaken for rebellion. Over time, the empire did not need to kill everyone. It only needed its subjects to remember how killing once looked. Fear became memory, and memory became law. Yet the paradox of cruelty is that it always reflects the society that practices it. The same culture that revered compassion and virtue created systems of pain so refined they bordered on art. The same scholars who wrote poems of love and filial piety also drafted codes that detailed exactly how long a man could be tortured before death. It is not hypocrisy, it is the duality of human nature. We seek beauty even in horror, justification even in sin. Modern minds might ask, how could they? But perhaps the better question is, how are we different? The public square may be gone, but the theater of punishment remains. Cameras replace crowds, outrage replaces ritual. The need to witness, to judge, to purge evil through suffering endures. The empire's legacy lives in every system that believes justice can be achieved through humiliation or destruction. The form changes, the instinct does not. At its core, the psychology of cruelty is about control. The emperor ruled not only through armies or edicts, but through imagination. He ruled by shaping what people feared. And fear, once internalized, becomes obedience without chains. When the people began to accept suffering as necessary, even righteous, they ceased to resist it. That is the most dangerous form of power, the kind that convinces its subjects that pain is moral. But there was another side to this dark coin. In every generation, there were those who saw through the illusion. Monks who prayed for the souls of the condemned. Scholars who wrote forbidden verses questioning the emperor's virtue. Peasants who whispered that no man, no matter how divine, could own the lives of others. Their resistance was quiet, but it was the first flicker of moral awakening, a recognition that the empire's cruelty was not cosmic order, but human choice. And still, even those who defied the system could not escape its imprint. The imagery of execution seeped into dreams, art, and language. Chinese literature is filled with metaphors of blood and balance, of cleansing through pain. The psychological residue of centuries of ritualized cruelty shaped an entire civilization's relationship with suffering. Pain became familiar, even poetic. To endure it with grace was to achieve virtue. To inflict it was to restore harmony. In that worldview, cruelty was not aberration, it was symmetry. This explains why the banned rites, though long gone, continued to haunt the national psyche. When a culture believes for thousands of years that pain maintains order, its shadow cannot vanish overnight. It lingers in authority, in silence, in the instinct to obey. The ghosts of executioners and emperors are not confined to tombs. They live in every act of unquestioned control, every belief that power must punish to preserve peace. Yet, within that same shadow lies an enduring lesson. If cruelty can be ritualized, so can compassion. If pain can be made sacred, so can mercy. The transformation is psychological, not political. When later generations finally abolished the tortures, when they dared to remember what had been forgotten, they were not only rewriting law, they were reprogramming the human heart. They were learning that balance does not come from blood, but from empathy, not from punishment, but from understanding. And that is perhaps the cruelest irony of all, that the same human mind capable of inventing Lingchi could also produce poetry, music, and philosophy of profound beauty. The capacity for horror and the capacity for compassion are born from the same source, the hunger to give meaning to existence. The empire's greatest tragedy was not that it was cruel, but that it believed cruelty was divine. In the end, the psychology of cruelty is not about China alone, it is about all of us. It reveals how easily civilization disguises its darkness, how morality can become a mask for fear, and how every society, no matter how enlightened, carries within it the temptation to justify suffering. The ancient execution grounds may be gone, but the theater of cruelty remains eternal, in memory, in imagination, and in the fragile architecture of the human soul. The empire has long fallen, yet its echoes remain. The crimson walls of the Forbidden City now stand silent, their stones heavy with memory. Once, those courtyards rang with judgment, now they breathe only wind. But beneath the calm lies an invisible presence, a shadow that history cannot cleanse. The forgotten execution rites, though buried and banned, still whisper through the centuries. They remind us that cruelty is not confined to the past, it evolves. The emperors may be gone, but the desire to rule through fear still hides within the human heart. Ancient China believed pain could restore harmony, that blood could balance heaven. Today, the symbols are different, yet the impulse remains. Control disguised as order, punishment disguised as justice. The victims of those rites are dust, their names erased. Yet in remembering them, we reclaim their humanity. Their suffering warns us that civilization's beauty often blooms beside horror, that the line between sacred and monstrous is drawn not by gods, but by men. In the silence of history, the emperor's shadow still breathes, not as a curse, but as a lesson. For as long as we remember what was done in the name of order, we keep the darkness from returning. Memory becomes mercy, understanding becomes redemption. The light survives because the past still speaks.